Step into the eastern woodlands in 1640, and the first thing you'll notice isn't the majesty of the ancient pines. It is the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a nature documentary, but the heavy, suffocating stillness of a room where someone has just been murdered. The air smells of charred hickory and damp earth, but beneath it, there is the metallic tang of dried blood and the acrid bite of spent black powder. You've been sold a story of the North American interior as a vast, untouched Eden, a place where people lived in stagnant harmony with the trees until the European arrival broke the spell. It's a comfortable narrative, but it treats the indigenous people as characters in a fable rather than what they actually were. Master strategists, high-performance warriors, and cold-eyed geopoliticians. The woods were a chessboard, and by the mid-17th century, one side had decided to flip the table. They were the Haudenosaunee, the 5 nations of the Iroquois. They didn't just fight, they industrialized the hunt and weaponized grief. They were an organic syndicate that realized, faster than anyone else, that in a world of global trade, you either become the monopoly or you become the waste. Today, we are looking at the Beaver Wars through the lens of a total war audit. We're stripping away the romanticism to see the raw, mechanical genius of the American Rome. An empire built on fur, lead, and the terrifying reclamation of human life. Long before the first Dutch trader stepped into the Hudson Valley, the Haudenosaunee had solved the most difficult problem of human organization. They had synchronized their violence. While other tribal groups operated as loose collections of villages, the Iroquois were a unified political machine. The Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca operated under a single constitutional framework, the Great Law of Peace. But do not mistake peace for pacifism. This was a non-aggression pact between the 5 fingers, so they could strike together as a single devastating fist. By the 1630s, this fist was looking for a target. The catalyst was the Castor canadensis, the North American beaver. To the Europeans, the beaver pelt was a luxury commodity for the fashion houses of London and Paris. To the Iroquois, it was a strategic currency. They understood the new economic ledger immediately. Pelts were the only way to acquire the tools of modern survival. Metal kettles that could be melted into arrowheads. Now steel knives that didn't shatter like flint. And most importantly, the flintlock musket. While the French to the north tried to keep firearms out of the hands of their Huron allies, the Dutch at Fort Orange were happy to trade lead and powder for fur. The Iroquois saw the gap in the market. They realized that if they could control the flow of fur from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic, they would become the supreme power on the continent. But there was one problem. They had already hunted their own lands to exhaustion. The math was simple. To get the guns, they needed the pelts. To get the pelts, they had to take the hunting grounds of their neighbors. And to do that, they would have to erase every rival confederacy from the map. There is a visceral reality to Iroquois warfare that modern history often tries to bury because it is too dark for a textbook. It's called the Mourning War. In the 1630s and 40s, the Haudenosaunee weren't just losing men to the warpath, they were being liquidated by a microscopic enemy. Smallpox and measles, invisible stowaways on European ships, were tearing through the longhouses. In some Seneca villages, half the population vanished in a single season. This wasn't just a tragedy, it was a catastrophic failure of the labor force and the military framework. The Iroquois response wasn't to mourn with tears, they mourned with raids. When a clan matriarch lost a son or a daughter, she didn't just grieve, she demanded a requickening. She would present the warriors with a belt of wampum and a command: "Go into the woods and bring me back a replacement." The goal of the war shifted from territory to the literal reclamation of human capital. If you were a Huron or an Erie warrior captured by an Iroquois war party, your identity was about to be audited in the most brutal way imaginable. You would be marched back to their village, subjected to a ritual of sensory and physical torture designed to break your connection to your old life. If you survived, and if you showed the necessary resilience, you weren't killed. You were adopted. You were given the name of the deceased family member. You were given their clothes, their seat in the longhouse, and their responsibilities. You ceased to be a Huron. You became a Seneca. This was a demographic blitzkrieg. The Iroquois were physically absorbing their enemies, swallowing entire tribes to keep their own numbers from crashing. They didn't just defeat you, they consumed you until your lineage became theirs. By 1648, the Haudenosaunee had decided that the time for small-scale raids was over. It was time for a total somatic liquidation of their primary rival, the Wendat, Huron Confederacy.
The winter yield was plenty.
The Wendat were the kings of the northern trade, the middlemen for the French. They were numerous, well-fortified, and powerful. But the Iroquois had spent the last decade accumulating a terrifying arsenal. While the French priests were busy converting the Wendat and discouraging the use of heathen weapons, the Iroquois had acquired over 800 muskets from the Dutch. In the winter of 1649, the Iroquois did the unthinkable. In the deep, sub-zero cold of the Great Lakes winter, a time when war was supposed to be impossible, over 1,000 Mohawk and Seneca warriors moved north on snowshoes. This was a high-speed kinetic strike. They didn't wait for the spring. They hit the Wendat villages of St. Ignace and St. Louis while they were still in their winter slumber. The result was a slaughter that redefined the geography of the continent. The Iroquois didn't just take the furs. They burned the longhouses, destroyed the food stores, and executed the leadership. The Wendat Confederacy, a nation of 30,000 people, collapsed in weeks. The survivors fled into the freezing woods, dying of exposure or surrendering to the Iroquois to avoid starvation. The forest was no longer a home. It was a slaughterhouse. The Haudenosaunee had cleared the board. In the following years, they turned their attention to the Petun, the Neutrals, and the Erie. One by one, these ancient confederacies were erased. By 1655, the Iroquois had created a dead zone of hundreds of miles around their territory, a buffer of empty woods where no one dared to hunt without their permission. The Iroquois didn't achieve this empire through luck. They achieved it through a terrifying mastery of the environment and psychological warfare. They were the inventors of the forest guerrilla style that would haunt European armies for the next 2 centuries. A Mohawk war party didn't move like a line of soldiers. They moved like a shadow. They could travel 50 miles a day through the densest brush, peering out of the mist to deliver a devastating volley of lead and then vanishing before the smoke cleared. They utilized the tomahawk and the ball-headed club, a heavy wooden weapon designed to shatter a skull with a single kinetic impact. With a proficiency that turned every close-quarters encounter into a visceral nightmare. They weaponized fear. They would leave the bodies of their enemies in specific, horrifying displays along the river routes to ensure that any survivor who escaped would spread the message. The woods belong to the Haudenosaunee. The French, supposed masters of the New World, found themselves barricaded in their forts at Quebec and Montreal, unable to step 100 yards past the palisades without risking a knife to the throat. The Iroquois had effectively paralyzed a European superpower. By the late 1600s, The Iroquois had become more than just a tribal union. They were a sovereign power playing the English and the French against each other with the sophistication of a European cabinet. They created the covenant chain, a complex system of alliances that allowed them to dictate terms to the colonial governors. They understood that the Europeans were just another resource to be audited. They would trade with the English to spite the French, then sign a peace treaty with the French to keep the English in check. They were the gatekeepers of the continent's interior. No one moved a pelt, a soldier, or a barrel of powder through the eastern woodlands without the consent of the Onondaga Council. This wasn't a story of people being swept away by the tide of history. This was a story of a people who seized the tide, she redirected it, and rode it to the height of imperial power. They had taken the technology of the invader, the gun, the steel, the trade, and used it to forge an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Mississippi and from the St. Lawrence to the Carolinas. We like to talk about the clash of cultures as a process of European dominance. But for over a century, the reality was the exact opposite. The interior of North America was an Iroquois world. The very names of the places we inhabit, the Great Lakes, the Ohio Valley, are haunted by the memory of their blitzkrieg. The Beaver Wars were a cold, calculated administration of violence. The Haudenosaunee saw a world that was changing, and they decided to be the ones who defined that change. They didn't mourn the passing of the old ways. They built a new, terrifying framework of survival. They turned their grief into a motor and their economic need into a sword. In the end, the empire wasn't broken by the French or the English. It was broken by the same thing that broke every empire: internal friction and the overwhelming, grinding weight of a larger machine. But for 100 years, the Iroquois were the undisputed masters of the dark woods. When you walk through those forests today, remember that the ground beneath you was once the most contested ledger on Earth. The silence isn't natural. It was earned. It is the lingering echo of a century where 5 nations merged into one fist and decided that the forest would either be theirs or it would be empty. The frontier does not reward the peaceful. It rewards the organized, the ruthless, and those who understand the price of the ground they stand on.